Good morning and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhāso, and this morning we'll be looking at another discourse from the Buddha. This one is Majjhima Nikaya number 32. So we'll start with paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll go through the discourse and give some explanations, and then I'll take any questions at the end. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So as mentioned, this is Majjhima Nikaya number 32, the Mahāgosinga Sutta, the greater discourse at Gosinga. So this is a discourse where several monks are invited to talk about what kind of monk they consider praiseworthy. So this is interesting because it gives a sense of how different people valued different aspects of monastic life. And at the very end of the discourse, then the Buddha gives his own description, which is also interesting for the contrast it offers to the descriptions offered by the other monks. So we'll go ahead and start reading through the sutta, and I'll give some explanation. So the sutta begins, "Thus have I heard. At one time the Buddha was staying in the Sal Forest Park at Gosinga, together with several well-known senior disciples, such as Venerable Sariputta, Mahamoggallana, Mahākassapa, Anuruddha, Revata, Ananda, and others." So these were all very well-known, highly respected monastic disciples of the Buddha. And most of the ones listed here were arhants, or were considered to be arhants. So the sutta continues. It says, "Then in the afternoon, Venerable Mahamoggallana came out of retreat, went to Venerable Mahākassapa, and said, 'Come, Venerable Kassapa, let's go to Venerable Sariputta to hear the Dhamma.' 'Yes, Venerable,' Mahākassapa replied. And they went to Sariputta, and they also invited Venerable Revata to come along, and so then you wind up with all of them coming together to see Sariputta. And Sariputta sees them, and he says, 'Come, Venerable Ananda, welcome Ananda, the Buddha's attendant who's so close to the Buddha.' And he says, 'Ananda, the Sal Forest Park at Gosinga is lovely. The night is bright, the sal trees are in full blossom, and divine scent seems to float on the air. What kind of monk would beautify this park?' So basically Sariputta is saying, like, this forest we're in is already so beautiful. What kind of monk would make it even more beautiful? Which is an indirect way of saying, like, what kind of monk do you think is the most praiseworthy? The kind of monk who you think brings the most praiseworthy qualities to a monastery or to a community. And Venerable Ananda replies, he says, 'Venerable Sariputta, it is a monk who has learned much, who remembers what they've learned, who stockpiles what they've learned. The Dhamma, which is good in the beginning, good in the middle, good in the end, meaningful and well phrased, describing a spiritual practice that's completely perfect and pure. They have learned much of such teachings, remembered them, reinforced them with recitation, mentally scrutinized them, and comprehended them theoretically.' So this is actually a bit odd, the translation here, comprehended them theoretically. The Pali term here is ditya supatividda. So ditya means through view or through perspective. So this means more than just a theoretical understanding. It also means actually seeing things in that way. So it's not just about having an intellectual idea of the Dhamma, but it's also seeing the reality of that Dhamma in your experience. And Ananda continues, he says, 'And they teach the four assemblies.' Four assemblies is the bhikkhus, bhikkhunis, lay women, and laymen. So the four corners of the Buddhist community. says, they teach the four assemblies in order to uproot the underlying tendencies with well-rounded, incoherent words and phrases. That's the kind of monk who would beautify this park. And then it says, when he had spoken, Venerable Sariputta said to Revata, Venerable Revata, Ananda has answered by speaking from his own inspiration. In other words, Venerable Ananda is describing his own perspective. And so Venerable Ananda described actually himself, basically. So Venerable Ananda himself was known for having learned a tremendous number of suttas, for having memorized all of the Buddhist teachings, for being the foremost in remembering and reciting the Buddha's teachings. So then Ananda we associate with having a tremendous body of knowledge about the suttas. So then, and also being a Dhamma teacher. Venerable Ananda was also famous for giving Dhamma talks based upon the suttas. So then naturally he praises a kind of monk who learns a lot of the suttas, who carefully analyzes and comprehends the suttas and then teaches them to other people. And now Venerable Sariputta is asking Revata, what kind of person, what kind of monk Revata thinks would beautify the forest, would glorify the forest. And Venerable Revata replies, a monk who enjoys retreat and loves retreat. They're committed to inner serenity of the heart. They don't neglect jhana. They're endowed with discernment, and they frequent empty huts. That's the kind of monk who would beautify this park. So in other words, a monk who's really into meditation practice. So first he says, one who's committed to samatha. So ceto, samatha, anuyuto. So the serenity of mind. So samatha. And is endowed with discernment. So that's vipassanaya samanagato, so that they have vipassana. So here vipassana is being used as a quality of mind, rather than necessarily as a category of meditation practices, but rather as the insightful characteristic of mind which arises as a result of doing meditation correctly. So they're practicing samatha, they're not neglecting jhana, so they're cultivating strong samadhi, they're developing vipassana, insight, based upon that strong concentration, and they like to be in empty dwellings. So empty, both in the sense of not being cluttered with a lot of possessions, but also empty in the sense of living alone, because in solitude, one is able to get the strongest meditation, the deepest meditation. So Venerable Revata was known for his commitment to meditation practice. So then it's not surprising that his answer of the best kind of monk is the one who's committed to doing a lot of meditation practice. And next Sariputta asks Venerable Anuruddha, what kind of monk Anuruddha thinks would glorify the park. And he replies, it's a monk who surveys 1,000 worlds with clairvoyance that is purified and surpasses the human, just as a person with clear eyes could survey 1,000 orbits from the upper floor of a royal longhouse. Kind of an odd way of saying things. Probably 1,000 fields. It would be a better translation here. Like standing from the top of a castle, you can look out over the fields and you can see 1,000 fields. I think that's more the point here. It actually reminds me of like being on a hilltop medieval village in Europe, and you can look out over the fields and you can see all the little separate plots of farmland spread throughout the countryside. So I think that's more the point he's making here. He says that's the kind of monk who'd beautify this park. So he's talking here then about psychic powers, the ability to see things from afar, to see even other worlds with the power of your mind. So this is what Anuruddha was famous for. He was famous for the cultivation of the the divine eye, the power of clairvoyance. And then Sariputta then asked Kassapa, he asked Mahākassapa, well, what kind of monk do you think would glorify this forest? And Kassapa replies, according to his inspiration, he says, it's a monk who lives in the wilderness, eats only alms food, wears rag robes, and owns only 3 robes. And they praise these things. They are of few wishes, content, secluded, aloof, and energetic, and they praise these things. They are accomplished in morality, concentration, wisdom, liberation, and the knowledge and vision of liberation, and they praise these things. That's the kind of monk who would beautify this park. So, of course, Venerable Mahākassapa was considered the foremost in asceticism. So naturally, he praises monks who are ascetics, monks who live a very simple and pure life. So living in the wilderness, surviving only on alms food, wearing rag robes and having only the bare minimum of robes. Those who have few wishes, who practice contentment, not wanting much, not interested in socializing. So they're secluded and aloof. They're not interested in socializing. They're energetic in the sense that they're committed to training the mind. Training the mind in, as he mentions, morality, concentration, and wisdom, sila, samadhi, and panya, to the point where they can attain a full liberation, complete purification of the heart from defilement. So, again, another beautiful way of talking about an ideal monk. And then Sariputta asked Mahamoggallana what he thinks is a good monk. And Venerable Mahamoggallana replies, he says, it's when 2 monks engage in discussion about the teaching. They question each other and they answer each other's questions without faltering, and their discussion on the teaching flows on. That's the kind of monk who would beautify this park. So this also is quite beautiful. So here it's emphasizing the ability of a monk to engage in conversation about Dhamma. The ability to ask and answer questions about Dhamma, and the ability to have an ongoing flowing conversation about Dhamma. So this is only possible for somebody who has a clear, fluid understanding of Dhamma. Then they can have these kinds of clear, fluid, ongoing back and forth conversations about Dhamma. And then Venerable Mahamoggallana says to Venerable Sariputta, each of us has spoken according to our own inspiration. And then he asked Sariputta the same question. He asked Sariputta what kind of monk Sariputta thinks would beautify the monastery. And Sariputta says, it's when a monk masters their mind and is not mastered by it. In the morning, they abide in whatever meditation or attainment they want. At midday and in the evening, they abide in whatever meditation or attainment they want. And in other words, they're able to set their mind to whatever they want to set it to. They can meditate in whatever way they want to. So they can make their mind do whatever they want to. So their mind doesn't wander, their mind isn't scattered or distracted. They can determine what they want their mind to do, and they can make it do that. So he's talking here about mastery of mind training through meditation practice. And he gives a metaphor. He says, suppose that a ruler or their minister had a chest full of garments of different colors. In the morning, they could put on whatever garments they want. In the midday, they could put on whatever they want. And in the evening, they could put on whatever they want. It says, in the same way, a monk masters their mind and is not mastered by it. In the morning, midday, and evening, they abide in whatever meditation or attainment they want. So this power of redirecting the mind at will. And Sariputta then says to the other monks, he says, each of us has spoken according to our inspiration. Come, venerables, let's go to the Buddha and tell him about this. And as he answers, so we will remember it. So he's like, well, now let's go and see what the Buddha has to say about this topic. So they go to the Buddha, bow and sit down to one side. They report the conversation to the Buddha, and they tell the Buddha about the answers that each monk gives. So first, saying about, they describe how Venerable Ananda answers. And the Buddha says, Sadhu, sadhu, Sariputta, Ananda answered in a way that is right for him. For Ananda has learned much, and the Buddha repeats what we have to say about Ananda, that he's learned a lot of these Dhamma teachings. So Ananda answered in that way because that was what he was particularly skilled in. And the same with Revata. So Revata was the one who praised retreat. And the Buddha says, yes, Revata answered in the right way for him because Revata enjoys retreat. Then Anuruddha, who spoke about clairvoyance. And the Buddha said, yes, Anuruddha answered in the right way for him because Anuruddha has clairvoyance. Then Mahākassapa, who praised asceticism, and the Buddha says, yes, Kassapa answered in the right way because for him, because he enjoys asceticism. Mahamoggallana, with the two monks who were questioning each other and conversing about the Dhamma, and the Buddha replies, Moggallana answered in the right way for him because Moggallana is a Dhamma teacher. And then Sariputta explains his answer about mastering the mind. And the Buddha replies, Sariputta answered in the right way for him because Sariputta has mastered his mind. And then Sariputta asked the Buddha, he says, Bhante, who has spoken well? In other words, he's saying, which of these is the best answer? Which of these is the best kind of monk? So is it the one who's learned a lot of the Dhamma, as Ananda said? Is it the one who enjoys meditation retreat, as Revata said? Is it the one who cultivates psychic powers like clairvoyance, as Anuruddha said? Is it the one who's very ascetic, living a very simple and contented life, as Mahākassapa said? Is it the one who is a great Dhamma teacher, who's very good at having conversations and discussions about Dhamma, as Mahamoggallana said? Or is it the one who masters their mind through dedicated meditation practice, as Sariputta said? And the Buddha says, you have all spoken well in your own way. In other words, the Buddha is saying all of these are actually good answers. They're all good answers which are relevant to each monk who gave them, but they're all good answers. So all these descriptions of monks that that were given these are all actually descriptions of good monks. And it's not that one is better than another. But the Buddha says, he says, listen to me also as to what kind of monk would beautify this salt-forest park at Gosinga. And he says, it's a monk who, after the meal, returns from alms round, sits down cross-legged, sets their body straight, and establishes mindfulness, thinking, I will not break this sitting posture until my mind is freed from the defilements through non-grasping. And he says that's the kind of monk who would beautify this park. And this is what the Buddha said, and satisfied, those venerables approved of what the Buddha said. So the Buddha's answer, he's very simple. His answer is very straightforward. He says the good monk is the one who sits down to do meditation practice with the determination to attain awakening. So very simple and straightforward response. So the main point of the sutta is, as I take it, is that there's different ways of living a monastic life, different focuses or specialties that one might have. And all of them are good in their own way. All of them are ultimately beneficial and helpful in their own way. But what the Buddha ultimately emphasizes is this commitment to attaining awakening as being the critical defining characteristic of a good monk. So it's not necessarily about how strictly they follow the Vinaya. It's not necessarily about necessarily how much meditation they do. It's not necessarily about their skill in doing ceremonies or rituals or anything like that, but it's about this commitment to progressing towards awakening. So that's the end of the discourse here. So we can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus, and then I'll see if there's any questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And hello to the people joining in online. Hello to Manal, Amy, Bhumika, Andrew, Nico, Jayanta, Rebecca, Jay, Maria, Sud, Gita, Edward, Snowflake, Karuna, Yankee, Norma, and Faze. Welcome to all of you. And I see one question here. It's a little off topic. So Snowflake is asking about the etymology of the word vipassana, which is a fun thing to talk about, but not really relevant to this sutta. So Snowflake, I would encourage you to bring that to monk chat. So this evening we have monk chat when you can ask any kind of question about Buddhism. So if you could bring it then.
Bhante, yeah. I'd like to hear your perception on something related to the sutta. And one of the things that I've thought about in the last couple of years is just how the Buddha kind of acknowledges and understands there's like a huge diversity of practice within the framework.
Yeah.
Like this is one, another example is a Dhamma follower, a faith follower. Another example is someone who's inclined towards Vipassana or Samatha. So there's like, I think a lot of people feel that there's only one exact way, or they kind of feel locked into like they have to do something a certain way, where they might be inclined differently depending on their personality and different factors. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really important point that we see throughout the sutta. This idea here that different people have different inclinations of mind, different strengths and weaknesses of mind. They have different capacities and character traits. And so then we all have the same goal, the goal of awakening. But we can have different approaches to Dhamma practice, which are all valid ways of training the mind in the direction of awakening. So that's also what I see in the sutta, is that like each of these monks gives their own answer of like these different ways of approaching Dhamma practice. And the Buddha is like, well, actually, all of those are correct. But then he gives like the one thread which ties all of it together, which is training the mind towards awakening. Because that was the common thread through all of the other monks. Like all of them, they were talking about their own practice that was pointing them towards awakening. The Buddha's like, actually, all of those are valid. But what's the common thread that ties them all together? It's that we're pointing the mind towards awakening. So definitely, I think this is one thing, is that the Buddhist life there's so many different ways that one can live a good Buddhist life. And the important thing is just that we're pointing the mind towards awakening. And we don't need to copy exactly the same way that somebody else is living a Buddhist life, or do things exactly the way some tradition or teacher says to do things. But rather it's trying to figure out what is most helpful and relevant for our own particular traits and situation. Yeah. And I see a couple more questions here. So Andrew says, any good biographies you would recommend on Venerable Moggallana and Sariputta? No, there aren't. In the suttas, there's hardly any biographical information about anyone. And I think this is deliberate because it's irrelevant. Doesn't really matter. There's a very small amount of information about Venerable Moggallana and Sariputta in a handful of places. And as you read through the suttas cover to cover, eventually you'll come across those little scraps of biographical information. But there's almost nothing, because it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter where you come from. What matters is practicing the Dhamma. So you will come across these quite elaborate biographical stories of different senior disciples of the Buddha. But those biographies don't come from the suttas. They're apocryphal stories which are very unlikely to be accurate. So you can find biographies of all the famous disciples of the Buddha. It's just those biographies are mostly fictional. And Sud says, The Buddha doesn't really mention the Eightfold Path here. Is it just implied they're all very adept at the Eightfold Path? Yeah, it's implied. It's implied that like naturally they're all following the Eightfold Path. That goes without saying. Yeah. And Sud says, how did clairvoyance help Anuruddha along the path of awakening? Why is it important to be able to even gain this ability? Well, I have to admit that's actually the least clear of the different examples given in this sutta. So all the other examples, it's actually quite clear what the point is, like the relevance to the path. So with clairvoyance, the divine eye in particular, it's not explained in this sutta, but elsewhere in the suttas, the divine eye is defined as being able to see beings dying and being reborn in accordance with their karma. So it's not just about like spying on your neighbors with your magic powers. It's not about like peeking in on the devas and seeing what the deva parties are like or something. Like that's not the point. That would just be playing around. But it's about having a very broad view of reality, which allows us to discern the principles of causality, the principles of karma, and therefore to cultivate wisdom based upon a wise understanding of causality. The core fundamental doctrine of Buddhism is causality. A clear understanding of causality itself is sufficient for awakening. Because with a clear understanding of causality, then one understands the causal basis of dukkha and the causal basis of wisdom. So then one will naturally stop creating the causes for dukkha and start creating the causes for wisdom. So it's not really clearly specified in this sutta, but I think that's the main point, is that when we talk about the divine eye, what's translated here as clairvoyance, dibbachaku, it's talking about the ability to clearly observe cause and effect, karma and rebirth, the process of birth and death in accordance with one's karma. And that is something which is helpful for developing wisdom. Okay, and Karuna says, when Bhante Suddhāso renders has answered by speaking from his heart, is this very far off? So it's not that it's very far off. It's just that it's a little bit excessively loose and interpretive for my particular tastes. So I tend to prefer translations that are a bit more literal than that. So I'm looking here for the exact Pali phrasing. So in particular, what he left out was the word patibana. So patibana means inspiration or eloquence. So they've explained based on their own inspiration. So based upon what inspires them about the Dhamma, like what it is that has been most relevant and helpful for them. So for example, Ananda emphasized knowledge of the suttas because for Ananda, that was the most important thing for helping him really understand the Dhamma. Revata emphasized silent solitary meditation retreat because that was what was most relevant for him, and so on. So like each one is speaking about their own inspiration, what inspired them or was most influential in their own personal practice. So it's not that Bhante Suddhāso's translation is wrong per se, it's just that it's a little less literal than I tend to like. But as you learn more Pali, then you'll understand these distinctions. And Ross says, so even disciples and Bhantes at that time, they do also sometimes compare with each other, like finding who is the best, LOL, like what we usually do now. Not quite, Ross. I think you're missing the point here a little bit. So keep in mind that the monks here, most of them were already either fully enlightened or had attained some stage of awakening. So this wasn't some kind of pissing contest, pardon the expression. This wasn't like, let's show off and figure out who's best, like my wisdom's better than yours kind of a thing. But it was more like, from each of our own perspectives, what do we consider to be a really wonderful monk, a really good monk? And so each of them describes what they consider to be a really good monk based on their own perspective, based on their own experience with Dhamma practice. And then when they go to the Buddha confirms that each one of them is correct from their own perspective. So it's not like one of them is more right than the other, but rather each one of them is correct from their own viewpoint. So it's not the same as people being like, oh, I'm better than you. No, I'm better than you. Like that's not what was going on here. It's more that each one of them was describing a valid, useful way of practicing Dhamma. And Brown says, not sure if this was covered, but may want to ask again, what is the main theme of the sutta? I think that was covered sufficiently. So you can see earlier in the session that was covered. That's the end of the, oh wait, here's one here. So Karuna says, one note I saw said the Buddha's answer was superior because he focused on establishing the cause, whereas his disciples gave results, as in the practice the Buddha gave would lead to the others. I think that's also missing it a bit because, for example, Revata was talking about meditation retreat, which is about causes. Sariputta was talking about training the mind, which is also in the domain of cause. So I'm not really sure I agree with that analysis. Now, I think what made the Buddha's answer superior was that he was emphasizing the result, actually. He was emphasizing awakening itself as the goal, whereas the others were emphasizing methodology. So I think it's actually the inverse, that each of the disciples was emphasizing a particular strategy of practice, whereas the Buddha was emphasizing that actually the point is awakening. It's pointing the mind towards awakening. And that's the last question. Anything from the residents here? Yeah, go ahead.
Not quite clear on like the question that is repeated in the sutta, which is what kind of bhikkhu friend Ananda could eliminate for Gosinga Savachuma?
Well, so it comes down to the verb sobeya. So sobeya comes from the word subha, which can mean either radiance or beauty. So in this translation, that verb is translated, I think it's translated beautify. Like who would beautify this? Yeah, to use the word beautify. Who would beautify this forest, this monastery? So illuminate is a bit of an odd translation there, because it has more the sense of like what would make this forest resplendent. If you wanted to capture that connotation of light, but get the point more clearly, I'd probably say what would make it resplendent. So it's not illuminate in the sense of like turn on the lights kind of thing, but rather illuminate in the sense of like what would make it radiant and magnificent. Okay, so maybe that's it for this morning. So we can go ahead and conclude with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.